So I have two quick disclaimers before we start. I want to give a thank you to the Little Mermaid fan site Daring to Dream that has been around for quite a while and was a great resource for this video. Secondly, as you probably know, Ursula has made a lot of appearances. I plan to cover most of them, but I will not be covering every single one. As comprehensive as these retrospectives aim to be, I don't want it to just become a massive list of cameos. That's not very fun to write, and I don't think it's all that fun to watch either. Regardless, we have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Welcome to the Renaissance. Disney Animation had been doing a little better by the late 80s. They were past the rough productions of The Fox and the Hound and The Black Cauldron, and movies like The Great Mouse Detective and Oliver and Company performed decently, if not well. But they really needed a hit, a big success, something that showed everyone the company still had the magic from when Walt was alive. They finally found that success with The Little Mermaid. The original story by Hans Christian Andersen was published in 1837. The melancholy tale follows a mermaid who spends her days wondering about the surface world. As the tradition goes, on her 15th birthday, she is allowed to visit the world above. Her older sisters have all made the journey already. Although there are parts of the world they enjoy, they generally prefer their home in the ocean. On her excursion, the Little Mermaid sees a ship with a handsome prince. She falls in love and ends up saving him when the ship goes down in a storm. She leaves him on land to be found by some girls from a church and swims off, more obsessed than ever. Her obsession doubles when she is told that humans have immortal souls, something that mermaids do not. Human souls live on past death, while mermaids simply turn to foam when their lives are over. The mermaid decides that she wants to be with the prince and to have a human soul, so she makes a dangerous trek to visit the sea witch. The path is full of polyps, living trees that never let go of whatever they ensnare. In the story's most chilling detail, one of them has even strangled another mermaid. The sea witch lives in a house made of bones of drowned sailors. This mysterious character surrounds herself with poisonous sea snakes, who she lovingly calls her little chickadees. The witch makes a deal with the mermaid. She will make her a potion that can give her human legs. With those legs, the mermaid will be a graceful dancer, but every step will be incredibly painful. The prince needs to fall in love with her and marry her. Then she can truly become human and have the soul to go with it. If he ends up choosing another bride, the mermaid will die the following morning. Also, she has to give her voice as payment for the potion. Even with a seemingly impossible task laid out in front of her, the mermaid still wants to go through with it. For a time, it seems the Little Mermaid turned human will actually wind up living happily ever after. The prince is enchanted by this lovely mute woman, and says she reminds him of the girl at the church who saved him. His parents insist he meet a princess from a neighboring kingdom, with marriage in mind. The prince goes to humor them, and lo and behold, the princess is the girl from the beach. The wedding follows shortly after. Our former Little Mermaid is heartbroken and prepares to turn back into foam when her sisters come to the rescue. They have traded their hair to the sea witch for a special knife. If the little human uses it to kill the prince, she can turn back into a mermaid. Our heroine almost goes through with it, but she can't bring herself to do the horrible deed. She is rewarded with the ultimate bittersweet ending. Her body does not turn to foam, but rather air. In this new form, she is in a sort of purgatory state. She travels the world bringing good vibrations to people, and in 300 years, she can finally earn the soul she dreams of. Although the story was changed considerably for the movie, it's interesting to see how many elements of the sea witch were carried over for Ursula. She still has a terrifying lair surrounded by polyps, even if their circumstances are different. She still dotes on her creepy pets, whether they're chickadees or poopsies, and the scene where the witch makes the potion is described very similarly to the one in the movie, where she throws all sorts of odds and ends into a cauldron. The sea witch is creepy, but she's more neutral than evil. Her spells come at a terrible price, but she's 100% upfront about it, and doesn't try to interfere afterward. Still, due to the story's religious themes, she could also be viewed as a satanic archetype with those supernatural deals. It's by rejecting the sea witch's second deal, the one where she must kill the prince, that the mermaid is able to avoid a completely tragic ending. She has triumphed over evil and will ultimately ascend to heaven, even if it takes a few centuries. Disney's first attempts to do The Little Mermaid date all the way back to the late 1930s. They wanted to do a movie about the life and stories of Hans Christian Andersen. The biographical parts would be live action and filmed by MGM, while the stories would be animated, very much akin to Song of the South in the future. There's some lovely concept art for the project out there, which really captures the dreamy sadness of the story. Their sea witch, meanwhile, is the thing of nightmares, a tentacled creature with a frog-like head. the proposed version stayed surprisingly true to the original fairy tale. In fact, it actually had a sadder ending. The mermaid turns to foam, but there's no mention of her becoming air and getting the chance at earning a human soul. Other projects ended up taking Walt's attention, and the movie was never made. In 1952, a movie musical about Andersen was released, putting the end to any lasting hopes of Disney making his version. The closest thing we had in Walt's lifetime was The Whale Who Wanted to Sing at the Met, another tragedy about a sea creature with a beautiful voice. But still, the mermaid had not yet sung her final note. In fact, she had not even begun to sing. It would just take a little more time. The story would be revisited in the mid-80s. During production of The Great Mouse Detective, co-director Ron Clements became enamored with the fairy tale and wrote a brief outline. Although it's simple, the outline establishes several important factors to differentiate the original and Disney stories. The Little Mermaid receives a name, Ariel. The creepy sea witch becomes an outright villainess, threatening to enslave Ariel for life if she can't win the prince's love in 3 days. Then, to make matters worse, the witch disguises herself as the maiden with the beautiful voice the prince has been searching for. This time, things turn out much happier for Ariel. Ron Clements and John Musker are incredibly talented directors, but even they would probably admit that one of the biggest assets to Mermaid's success was the team of Howard Ashman and Alan Menken, who came on board to write the songs. Menken ended up writing the entire underscore as well, and Ashman worked closely with the directors, fine-tuning the story and writing a few of the most effective scenes himself. Ashman was also involved in the casting of the Sea Witch, now named Ursula. A fan of Dynasty, his first choice was Joan Collins. This greatly influenced how Ursula was written in the screenplay and initially designed. Meanwhile, the director's first choice was B. Arthur, but her agent turned it down. Another big contender was Charlotte Rae. Ashman was also pursuing Elaine Stritch. A number of others were considered, but it eventually came down to Rae versus Stritch. Stritch got the part, but soon butted heads with Ashman over how she should perform Ursula's song. The role finally went to Pat Carroll, who continued to voice Ursula for many years to come. Carroll had a long career before and after The Little Mermaid, but she will probably best be remembered for her wonderful performance as the Sea Witch.
That was a close one. Too close. The little tramp. Oh, she's better than I thought.
As all this was happening, the character's design was slowly coming together. Ursula went through many different shapes, sizes, and even species. The idea was always to make her a merperson with a very unfriendly-looking fish half, but what creature would it be? Concept art shows her as a scorpionfish, manta ray, pufferfish, and more. Animator Matt O'Callahan drew her as being part octopus, which her head animator, Ruben Aquino, eventually chose. Funny enough, the design for the Sea Witch all the way back in the 40s also had tentacles. Roy Disney was especially happy with this turn of events. He had directed a documentary, Mysteries of the Deep, which featured all sorts of sea creatures, including octopi. He made sure the animators didn't just focus on the human half of Ursula, but on her body as well, taking full advantage of such a distinct character design. Actually, Ursula only has 6 tentacles, which were easier for the animators to handle. If we're being technical, she's still an octopus, because if you regard her 2 arms as tentacles, that would bring the count to 8. Even with her voice and tentacles chosen, there was still the matter of her top half. Inspiration was taken from a number of people. Aside from the initial Joan Collins influence, some concept art by Dan Haskett based her on Patti LaBelle. Rob Minkoff's artwork took influence from Divine, a drag performer famous for his roles in John Waters movies. Even then, other animators had their own takes on the character and her motivations. Kathy Zielinski thought of Ursula as someone like Norma Desmond, the ex-starlet from Sunset Boulevard. Both characters are divas that have fallen from grace and want to be back on top. They don't care about the little people, but they need them. Norma wants blind adoration, Ursula wants fear. Pat Carroll similarly viewed Ursula as a former Shakespearean actress who is now stuck selling used cars. One of the final players in the creation of Ursula has largely gone uncredited. Actor Max Kirby was filmed for live-action references doing a choreographed dance to Poor Unfortunate Souls. While Disney has shared a decent amount of footage of actors doing the same thing for Ariel and Eric, the Kirby material is currently unreleased. As the story developed, Ashman suggested that Ursula be Triton's sister. He and Menken wrote an early version of the opening song, Fathoms Below, that not only set up the merpeople, but also set up the idea that Ursula is out there, seeking vengeance. Fathoms below in the ocean lives Ursula, witch of the sea. She plots and she schemes and she wickedly dreams of the day when she'll return once more, return to rule the ocean floor. I love this verse. but the directors rightfully decided that it was too much exposition at the very beginning of the movie and cut it. Ursula's backstory, along with her relation to Triton, are left vague. As we will see, many subsequent materials will have their own separate interpretations of who Ursula is, what exactly she did to get banished, and whether or not she's a blood relative of the royal family. Personally, I can take it or leave it. Having them be siblings adds some extra bad blood to their conflict, but there's already plenty of that even when they're not related. Another early idea was to have Ursula kept in the shadows for her first couple scenes. We would only see her hand the first time, manicuring her nails with a fish skeleton. In her second appearance, we would see a close-up of her mouth as she ate a shrimp, and then her shadow, but it was only when Ariel met her that we would get our first proper look at the witch. It would have been an effective build-up, but Ursula is such a strong character that she really didn't need something like that. Presumably, the directors realized this early on, and allowed the animators to have their fun, showing off Ursula in all her tentacled glory. Another discarded idea for Ursula's introduction would have shown her business practices. A bespectacled, nerdy merman named Harold would have made a deal to become irresistible to women. In return, Ursula wants a special flower. Unbeknownst to Harold, the flower isn't in season, so he can't find one. As punishment, he joins her garden of writhing polyps. Harold would have been of some minor importance in this version. He is prominently seen when Ursula plans to ensnare Ariel, and the screenplay specifically mentions that he's the polyp that tries to get the mermaid to turn back. They also made a special note that he's among the freed merpeople when the spell's broken. It seems the poor merman was there from pretty early on, even before Ursula's octopus design was finalized. In the storyboards, we can see that one of the past victims conjured up during Poor Unfortunate Souls is Harold, although he loses the glasses in the final version. During the song, you can still see a polyp wearing glasses, but I don't think this is meant to be Harold. Based on the other polyps around him, they look like your typical nuclear family, meaning that Ursula's cruelty extends to small children as well. After getting banished from the kingdom of Atlantica for mysterious wicked deeds, Ursula has set up shop in a deep, dark corner of the ocean. She offers merpeople their greatest desires, but there's always a price to pay. Based on what she does to Ariel, not to mention the deleted scene with Harold, Ursula always tips the scales in her favor and actively sabotages her customers. When they can't pay up, she turns them into the writhing, worm-like polyps that make up her personal garden. It's a nice hobby, but what she really wants is to get back in the palace. Not just as a member of the royal court, but as the queen. That way, she'll get her revenge on Triton and control the Seven Seas. And for that, she needs to take advantage of a lovesick mermaid with no one else to turn to. Ursula never tries to hide her creepy nature. The screenplay called for her to live in a whale skeleton, but the artists went a few extra miles and designed a giant sea monster skeleton instead. Based on some deleted storyboards, the journey from Atlantica to Ursula's lair is a long and treacherous one. She was banished after all. If the trip and the subsequent sight of the monster didn't deter her clients, I imagine all the polyps would. The merpeople who stick around are either desperate or foolish. Maybe they really need what only Ursula can grant them, or maybe they think they can pull one over on the sea witch and come out on top. In fact, there's a chance that every now and then someone actually has succeeded, but the risk is still huge, and the chances of that happening are probably pretty slim. Now, a couple things regarding this still needed a little fine-tuning in the script department. An early version of her big scene had a much more combative Ursula, harshly insulting the Little Mermaid when she comes to her lair. This one also confirms exactly what she got banished for.
Because I was ambitious? Because I made a few pitiful attempts to elevate my station in life?
You tried to overthrow my father.
Oh, these things get so blown out of proportion.
The scene was rewritten when they realized that if Ursula started off with that attitude, even someone as desperate and vulnerable as Ariel would be liable to leave. Instead, even though Ursula still makes a passive-aggressive jab at her, the final scene shows a much more inviting sea witch. There's something both repulsive yet alluring about her. We find ourselves getting drawn in, right alongside Ariel. That's the biggest reason Ursula has such a long line of victims. She's very good at what she does. The character is written to be incredibly seductive, both in a physical and emotional sense. She tends to flirt with her customers, even Triton himself. One of the storyboards has her pinching his cheek. Her whole song with Ariel is quite sensual, with her shaking and shimmying all around, really showing off that body language. Aside from the final battle, this sequence is Ursula's moment to shine, especially with that song. Originally, Menken and Ashman wrote a song called Silence is Golden, which Ashman quickly decided wasn't good enough, and they wrote Poor Unfortunate Souls almost immediately afterward. Silence isn't even that bad, but it really doesn't stack up to the other song. Musically, it reminds me of some of the songs they wrote for Little Shop of Horrors, namely Now It's Just the Gas, and Seymour's section of The Meek Shall Inherit. The Cut song focuses almost entirely on Ariel being mute as part of their deal. The cabaret-style Poor Unfortunate Souls, meanwhile, is a musical masterpiece. Even though we've already met Ursula at this point, this is the scene where she makes her sales pitch and has to reel Ariel in. She sings about how she's just misunderstood and wants to help the unfortunate merpeople. We know she can't be trusted, but it's so hard not to find the performance compelling. It still has a verse about how being silent won't be so bad, but it's nestled into the bigger picture. The song grows more manic as Ursula puts pressure on Ariel to sign the contract. The animation follows suit, with Ursula's faces and poses getting more exaggerated. We end on the incantation to turn Ariel human, which was actually lifted from the previous Silence is Golden. The visual at the end, with the smoke hands pulling Ariel's voice out of her throat, manages to be disturbing on a visceral level, even though nothing graphic actually happens. Then there's Ariel's frantic swim to land, practically drowning seconds after becoming human. It's never really explained, but I know Ursula doesn't want to kill her. She needs Ariel to lose by the third sunset, but she can't use a dead mermaid as a bargaining chip with Triton. I assume this was meant to leave her in a disoriented state, but if she really was going to die, Ursula probably would have low-key helped her get to the surface in time. I also want to mention a deleted verse from the middle that was cut for time. It was probably the right move, but I really like it. Some of the lyrics include, "Come on, I know you need a little magic. And magic is my specialty du jour. Don't just stand there looking sick. Would I kid you, play a trick? Like I told you, I don't do that anymore." Ariel ends up doing better than Ursula intended, and even she seems a little impressed in spite of her frustration. But the Sea Witch never plays fair, especially with so much at stake. Using Ariel's voice, she turns into a lovely maiden and hypnotizes Prince Eric. Since he keeps talking about this mystery woman with a beautiful voice he wants to marry, no one seems too concerned when the bewitched prince calls for the marriage immediately. In this disguise, Ursula calls herself Vanessa, although her name is only revealed in the credits. Vanessa isn't entirely identical to Ariel, but there's a strong resemblance, just with darker hair and meaner features. Naturally, since she has Ariel's voice, the character is performed by Ariel's voice actress, Jodie Benson. She doesn't have too much dialogue, but Benson seems to be having fun playing a nastier character. She also gets to sing her own little reprise of Poor Unfortunate Souls. All this leads to an amazing final battle in a raging storm with a superpowered sea witch. Originally, the showdown wasn't going to be as big a set piece. Ursula would have grown a little larger with the power of the trident, but Ariel would have knocked it out of her hands at one point. Using her tentacles, Ursula tries to both strangle and drown Eric. Sebastian recovers the trident and gives it to the prince, who either zaps her or throws it into her like a javelin, depending on the draft. Another idea was to have Ursula attack him with the trident, but Eric touches it with a harpoon, electrocuting Ursula. It was exciting, but not exciting enough for CEO Jeffrey Katzenberg. He apparently told the directors, "I want more Die Hard." Now, trying to take an animated fantasy musical and make it more Die Hard sounds like a nebulous task, but they rose to the challenge. So did Ursula. In the final ending, Ursula uses the trident to transform herself into a giant. The kraken-like monster creates a terrible storm and starts shooting at Ariel. Meanwhile, the storm is so powerful that it brings a sunken ship to the surface. Eric steers it right into Ursula, piercing her through the gut. It's nowhere near as gory as I'm making it sound, but it's a thrilling end to such a wonderful villain. As I said, the directors of this movie had previously done The Great Mouse Detective, and it seems like they learned a lot from working with Ratigan. For a while, Disney villains were either funny but not all that threatening, like Edgar and Prince John, or they were threatening but not all that fun, like Sykes and the Horned King. I think Madame Medusa fell somewhere in the middle, but Ratigan was the perfect blend of entertainingly campy and genuinely menacing. Ursula continued this trend, and is now viewed as one of the all-time greats. Almost every one of those all-time greats has a henchman or two. Typically, we think of these minions as being bumbling comic relief, but Ursula's Moray eels, Flotsam and Jetsam, are very efficient. Not only that, but they're creepy, sinister figures. They're lovable in their own devious way, but they're not exactly a barrel of laughs. The eels are almost identical in personality, voice, and appearance. The only way to differentiate them is their glowing eyes. Flotsam's right eye glows, while it's the left eye for Jetsam. I imagine, before the events of the movie, they used to help Ursula find her victims. Being banished, she couldn't exactly go out and find them herself. Her eels would presumably keep tabs on merfolk of interest, and then reach out to them when the time was right. When the duo give Ariel their sales pitch, you can tell they're a pair of old pros. They take turns speaking, practically finishing each other's sentences. They're rough-looking creatures, sharing a raspy voice by Patty Edwards, but there's still something smooth and enticing about them, especially in this scene. They definitely take after their boss in this regard.
You and your prince, together, forever.
Given that they're Ursula's familiars, magic creatures that aid witches, it makes sense that the eels have a supernatural aura. Anything they see through their glowing eyes is shown in Ursula's crystal ball back at her lair. They're also able to hear her give them orders. Because of this otherworldly connection, they seem much closer with Ursula than other sidekicks are to the main villains. The best comparison I can think of is Diablo, Maleficent's raven from Sleeping Beauty. Plus, every task Ursula assigns to them, they accomplish. They spy on Ariel, they persuade her to visit Ursula, they prevent Ariel and Eric from kissing. These are two valuable fish to have around. We don't see Ursula inflicting pain on them, insulting them, or anything like that. She's downright affectionate with her eels, treating them like pampered pets. Given that she's been banished, the only other people she ever gets to talk to are future victims. The eels are her only connection to the outside world. I think she recognizes their value not just as competent minions, but also as her only friends. Even the contract she presents to Ariel is decorated with an illustration of her precious eels. There's also a Mickey Mouse head in the middle for a couple frames. Those Disney lawyers are everywhere. The only time the eels technically fail is when Flounder and Sebastian fight back to make them release Eric. Even then, Ursula has her trident aimed at him and still would have hit her mark if Ariel hadn't thrown her off. Instead, she zaps the eels, reducing her little poopsies to tiny pieces. Her distraught reaction is completely sincere, and just for a moment, we mourn with her. In the movie's underscore, Ursula's theme is predictably based on her song. Flotsam and Jetsam, meanwhile, have their own slithery theme. Most of the foes found in the Little Mermaid franchise are underwater creatures, but there's one human thrown into the mix. Chef Louis, who loves the fine art of seafood cuisine. In fact, he loves it to an almost unhealthy extent. From Sebastian's point of view, the man is a crazed killer, relishing in chopping up little fish. From your average human's point of view, it's not all that different. Louis is introduced in the darkly hilarious song Les Poissons as he prepares a dinner of cooked crabs. His attitude borders on sadistic, singing lines like, "Then I stuff you with bread, it won't hurt 'cause you're dead, and you're certainly lucky you are." The performance by René Aubergenois sells this man as having more than a screw loose. Sebastian's subsequent attempt to escape the kitchen results in a wonderful slapstick scene that feels like it came from a Warner Brothers or MGM cartoon. Disney never did madcap slapstick like this quite as much, but perhaps they took a few cues from the previous year's Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's brief, but it's a great throwback to the fun-filled, violent cartoons of the Golden Age. You might be saying, but Louis doesn't know the fish are sapient. None of the humans do. That's correct. In fact, in the original script, Louis was going to make peace with the sea creatures at the end. During the wedding, he would menacingly raise his knife at Sebastian, but then it's revealed that he's innocently cutting a slice of wedding cake. Katzenberg didn't think this was funny enough, and insisted Louis continue his chase. Not all of Katzenberg's ideas were winners, but he really had something here. It would be touching if Louis found other recipes, but it wouldn't be entertaining. Instead, he chases Sebastian again and loses. Painfully. His unrepentance, plus his return in several follow-ups as Sebastian's archenemy, lands him on the villain list. Louis actually muddies the waters a bit. Pun intended. He proves Triton's point. Some humans are nice, but some are just as bloodthirsty about killing fish as the king fears. It does make me wonder what will happen to Eric's kingdom in the future. Based on their massive fishing vessels and them being right by the ocean, I imagine fish made up a pretty large part of their economy. Will they work out some sort of agreement with the merpeople? I mean, Triton rules over the ocean, but predators are still allowed to eat meat. Speaking of, I've made it a point to not go too in-depth with predators in this series, since they're acting on instinct and not malice. Still, as long as we're on the subject, I might as well give a little attention to the shark that chases Ariel and Flounder at the beginning. In the script, the shark's name is Glut. I think it was a good idea to leave him unnamed in the final movie. A name implies sapience, and it's one of those things that raises a number of questions about how this world works. Glut comes across as a feral creature, but are there any laws against him eating merpeople? Would Triton have the right to prosecute him if he ate Ariel? Plus, in the script, Flounder even knows the shark's name, implying some level of understanding between the two even as the shark chases him, although it could just be a nickname Flounder came up with. These questions are never answered, and they really don't need to be, but it's fun to think about. Glut was actually going to return later in the movie when Flounder is trying to get Ariel to the wedding ship. Although he fled in terror before, now Flounder uses his wits against the predator. He hooks Glut onto the barrel holding Ariel and swims ahead. The shark chases him, pulling Ariel to the ship faster than Flounder ever could. As Ariel disembarks, the shark bites the barrel, which is full of dynamite. That's the end of Glut. The scene was cut to simplify the story. It's too bad to see Flounder miss out on his big moment of heroism, but this means in the final cut, he managed to tow Ariel all the way there himself. Not bad for a little fish. I should also mention that a piece of concept art shows Ursula with a shark henchman. I've only found this one drawing, so I'm guessing this was either a very early idea, or one that never really got developed beyond a rough sketch. And now it's time to take a gulp and take a breath and talk about the remake. If you've watched my videos, you know I often have not cared for these new live-action versions. Either they're doing pretty much what the original movie did, only not as well, or they're making changes that tend to overcomplicate the plot or completely miss the point of the story. Sadly, The Little Mermaid continues this trend. Melissa McCarthy plays Ursula this time around. There's more emphasis put on how the isolation from banishment has driven the sea witch mad. That admittedly makes sense, and even in the Flotsam and Jetsam section, I mentioned how lonely it must get with only a couple of eels as your friends. McCarthy's off-kilter acting actually sounds a bit like how Elaine Stritch would have played the character. John Musker mentioned she made the character sound a little tipsy, and that's really coming through with McCarthy's performance. In an interview, McCarthy even describes the character's movements as slinky and sliding off a bar stool. Also, Ursula has been made Triton's sister again, meaning that Ariel has herself a wine aunt. One of the weirdest lines comes when Ariel meets Ursula for the first time. She says Triton claims Ursula makes trouble between humans and merpeople. This plot thread is never brought up again, making me wonder if this was a holdover from an earlier draft that tried to go in a different direction. As far as we know, Ursula has just been her usual self, tormenting the ocean dwellers for fun. In fact, it was actually kind of nice to have them actually play this straight. After characters like Jafar and Gaston were underplayed, or Cruella being made into a full-on anti-hero, I'm all for a traditional villainess. Another nice touch is Ursula's tentacles glowing. It adds some visual flair. There also appears to be a reference to the original Fairytale. When Ariel enters the lair, she sees a mermaid skeleton caught in the polyps. Actually, in this version, they're more like the OG carnivorous plants. Instead of turning merpeople into polyps, Ursula just kills them, littering her lair with their skulls. Another bit of confusion comes from Ursula's introduction. The scene where she eats a trembling shrimp is very effective in the original movie. They do it again here, complete with the shrimp making little whimpering noises. The problem is, less than 5 minutes before that, we see Scuttle eating a fish herself, so Ursula's actions don't come across as nearly so cruel. Then there's the decision to downplay the love story. If you've looked up Disney movies online in the last 20 years or so, you'll have no doubt seen at least some discourse. For years, people have complained about how Ariel gave up her life to go off with some boy. The thing is, they either don't remember the movie or don't understand it. Ariel loves the entire human world, and even though Eric is a huge part of it, there's more to this than just scoring a husband. The remake pushes back against these complaints by playing up the human world aspect. Unfortunately, while it gets its point across, it comes at the detriment of the love story. One of the ways this comes into play is the change to Ursula's plan. Ariel still only has 3 days to kiss Eric, but Ursula enchants her so that any time the kiss is brought up, she promptly forgets about it. I have a feeling this was to make Ariel's need to kiss Eric less urgent in her head, so she can get to know him more organically. And to some extent, I understand that. The scene where they bond over Eric's collection of treasures is very charming. But, at the same time, it overcomplicates the plot and puts a lot of the dramatic thrust on Ariel's animal friends. This could have made for some great character acting in the animated version, but the realistic CGI animals are unable to show enough emotion to make this work. Another dramatic misstep occurs after Ursula transforms into Vanessa, played by Jessica Alexander. In the classic movie, this led to a hypnotized Eric ordering a hasty wedding. Here, it's been changed to an engagement announcement. Now, in the grand scheme of things, these are both just distractions as the clock ticks down. No matter what happens, the important thing is that the sun sets before Ariel and Eric kiss. But narratively, racing to stop a wedding is much more cinematic than an engagement. Then, of course, there's what they did to poor unfortunate souls. McCarthy's performance is very spirited, but they've cut a verse. The one about Ariel needing to give up her voice because the men up there don't like a lot of blabber. According to interviews, this is because someone behind the scenes was concerned that this part of the song would make little girls in the audience feel like they shouldn't speak out. But Ursula is a villain and obviously shouldn't be trusted. In both the original and the remake, they don't try to hide this at all. She's not a twist villain, she is clearly evil from her first second on screen. I feel like doubting the intelligence of little girls is doing them a major disservice. I can only speak from my own perspective, but as a little boy, I knew this was a lie. I liked talking to people, boys and girls alike. I hope that kids today are smart enough to think the same. Something media literacy. Flotsam and Jetsam feel like a non-presence. As I said, none of the animal characters are terribly expressive, but the poor eels probably got the worst. They don't even get to speak, so their blank faces are more of a detriment. At least Flounder's voice can help inform us how the fish is feeling, but the eels give us nothing. It's true they weren't all that deep in the original movie, nor did they speak that much, but they still felt like characters as opposed to creepy accessories. I should look on the bright side. At least they didn't rap. Their species have also changed. They've gone from being morays to electric eels. Somehow, they even have the power to seemingly kill or at least grievously injure King Triton. I imagine the magical contract probably had something to do with this, but it's still a level of power we've never seen the characters display anywhere else. A final note on the remake. They've actually taken some concept art from the original movie and put it to use here. Ursula lives inside a whale skeleton instead of a sea monster, which is how her lair was originally designed. There's also a shot at the end of the final battle with the gigantic Ursula reaching down to the boat, which again seems to be based on an old storyboard. Despite all my kvetching, I know that many talented people work on these remakes. I really hope their skills can be better utilized in the future, preferably on something original. Let me put it this way. These remakes feel like the massive wave of direct-to-video sequels we got back in the 90s and 2000s. The thing is, those were made by smaller, cheaper production teams. If they ended up being good, it was a nice thing to have. If they ended up being really not very good, you could write them off as being cheap cash grabs. With the live-action remakes, you have industry professionals with much larger budgets, but they're generally still not very good, so the outcome is all the more disappointing. But that's a good cue to dive back into animation and talk about one of those sequels. In Return to the Sea, we meet Ursula's crazy sister, Morgana. According to a fascinating interview with the movie songwriters on the TIARA talk show, the part originally belonged to Anne Bancroft. It even almost looks like the character was designed with her in mind. She was fired when she pushed back against performing the song that had been written for her. Ironically, the song was later cut. It weirdly parallels what happened with Elaine Stritch in the original movie. With their actress gone, the producers fell back on the ever-reliable Pat Carroll to perform the voice. It's always nice to hear Carroll, but this makes the whole thing feel like even more of a retread than it already is. Like many sequels, they repeat a good deal of the first movie's story, practically beat for beat. This time, Ariel's daughter, Melody, is the rebellious one, wanting to live in the ocean instead of on land. Ariel has deliberately kept Melody away from the sea because of Morgana. The child is the perfect target for the villainess, who takes her hostage when she's a baby and tries to feed her to a shark. When the plan is thwarted, Morgana hides out in her Fortress of Solitude, threatening to return someday. Triton's soldiers scour the sea for years, but never find her. Maybe they assume no one would be crazy enough to live in the Arctic, although Morgana doesn't seem to mind all that much. No one does, really. Her shark minion complains, and Melody bundles up a tiny bit, but it's treated as more of an inconvenience than unbearably frigid. The new sea witch in town initially sounds like she's trying to avenge her sister's death, but we soon learn that she wants to outdo Ursula. Her mother always loved Ursula best, and Morgana wants to prove herself by accomplishing what her sister never could. She shares Ursula's gift of manipulation, which she pulls off rather well with Melody, but she lacks the magic skills. She's able to temporarily turn Melody into a mermaid, but she has to use some leftover magic that Ursula conjured up rather than her own potions. Morgana is no Ursula, as the movie keeps reminding us, but she's certainly ruthless. Ursula was a bigger threat, but Morgana manages to outdo her sister in one aspect. She's a dark cloud over the royal families. The fact that she's always out there, waiting to strike, causes Ariel and Eric to wall themselves off from the ocean for 12 years. The moment where we see Flounder with his unfortunate adult redesign clinches this for me. Morgana has stolen years of happiness from the characters we love. Even if she can't live up to Ursula's legacy, both in and out of the film, you have to admit she managed to do a long-term number on the heroes. Perhaps it's because of this that her punishment is arguably worse than Ursula's. When King Triton regains his trident, he encases the witch in some very heavy ice. It sinks to the bottom of the sea, with the still-conscious Morgana trapped forever in the darkness. I know we're in the Arctic, but that's cold. As I mentioned, Morgana initially had a song, the sort of rock and roll sounding Gonna Get My Wish, written by Michael and Patty Silvershire. It's not their strongest song, but I have no idea why it was cut. The movie is fairly short, they lost their original actress over it, and most glaring of all, it was fully animated and colored. Animation is an expensive, time-consuming medium, and most of the time when you see deleted scenes, they're unfinished. It's usually regarded as a waste of resources to cut a completed scene unless you have a really good reason. This one's a mystery to me. In addition to her deleted song, Morgana received a theme from composer Danny Trube. Morgana's main henchman is Undertow the Shark. He's gigantic, possibly even bigger than Glut, and he can actually speak, voiced by Clancy Brown. While it's ambiguous how evil Glut was, Undertow is firmly on the bad guy side. After a blast from the trident, he winds up as a cute, shrimpy little shark for a good portion of the movie. This ends up helping Morgana's plans. Undertow is the one to lead Melody to Morgana's lair, and she might not have been as trusting to a full-size shark. Not that Undertow is happy with the situation. From the moment he gets transformed, he wants to go back to normal. Unfortunately, the Triton's power is strong, and Morgana isn't as well versed in spells. I can't help but feel like there's a Freudian subtext here. Most likely there isn't, but this dialogue doesn't help.
Forgive him, dear. He's got a little size issue.
He finally does turn back into a full-size shark, but it doesn't last long. The movie's Timon and Pumbaa knockoffs lead him into a wall of ice, which he crashes through. This saves a trapped Melody, and we're left with the visceral image of Undertow's teeth falling out. They used a similar gag with Chef Louis in the original movie, but they didn't linger on it, nor did they put so much emphasis on his empty sockets. This looks like one of those horrible Elsa dentist games that were all over YouTube in the mid-2010s. Luckily for Undertow, he's a shark, so at least some of those teeth should grow back. Undertow also received his own theme in the score. The other henchmen, a pair of manta rays named Cloak and Dagger, don't get as much focus. They're clearly based on Flotsam and Jetsam, but they never speak. Their occasional giggles and grunts are supplied by D. Bradley Baker. Like Ursula's eels, they're more than capable of making trouble, but without a voice or truly stunning animation, they don't leave much of an impact. I will say the battle between the animal sidekicks near the end was actually a little more harrowing than the one between the heroes and Morgana. Sebastian's foe, Chef Louis, appears again, still happily working in the castle. When Sebastian accidentally ruins his cake, he starts chasing the crab around with the usual violent intent. Ariel doesn't seem to notice any of this, focusing on Melody instead. Otherwise, it seems like Louis trying to kill Sebastian has become so commonplace that no one even bats an eye anymore. He must be one skilled chef if he can repeatedly get away with trying to cook what is essentially a family member at this point. Before we discuss the prequel, Ariel's Beginning, I need to say a few words about King Triton. His Majesty is a very difficult character to get right. You need to have him be controlling and hot-headed enough to drive Ariel away, but you also need him to be a benevolent, loving father in spite of his mistakes. He cares deeply about his daughters and his subjects. Plus, he's often right. Ariel is reckless and always gets herself in trouble even when humans aren't involved. Triton is the kind of character we actively root against as kids, and then realize his good qualities as adults. That's why Ariel's Beginning always rubbed me the wrong way. There is a villainess who we'll get to in a moment, but she's a smaller scale character in the grand scheme. In this movie, Triton is the real overarching villain, plain and simple. In the prologue, we learn that his wife, Athena, was killed by pirates. We can assume that fuels his hatred of humans, but that's not what this movie's about. When she was alive, Athena loved music. After her death, the grief-stricken Triton can't stand to be reminded of her. and so he does the perfectly rational thing and outlaws music in his kingdom. Anyone even making a few musical notes gets sent to the dungeon. Even the uptight council in Footloose only banned rock music and dancing. That's still extreme, but it's at least better than banning music entirely. Yes, Triton was stubborn about humans in the first movie, but it comes from a place of real concern and love for those around him. When Ariel challenges him about why they can't have music, he doubles down and refuses to answer. The movie explains that he essentially lost his heart when Athena died, but he keeps this up for 10 whole years, making everyone around him miserable, especially his daughters. This petulant king is not the Triton we know and love. Of course he ends up relenting, but it makes for a frustrating story. The more easily identified villain is Marina Del Rey, voiced by Sally Field. Triton has distanced himself from his daughters and put the governess in charge of them. She acts like an underwater Miss Hannigan, hating the girl she's been saddled with, especially the rebellious redhead. I remember when the movie was coming out, and all we had of Marina were a few still images. Fans speculated that this wasn't just about Ariel's beginning, but that Marina was going to turn to the dark arts and become Ursula. An interesting idea, but I highly doubt these characters are the same person. Ursula is put together, charming, cunning, and wants world domination. Marina has no self-control, little self-awareness, and relatively smaller goals. She just wants to be Triton's second in command. That position belongs to her nemesis, Sebastian. Poor Sebastian has it rough with people like Louis and Marina after him. Something about the little crab attracts the ire of the mentally unstable. He doesn't really help himself by criticizing Marina's job performance, but he's right that she's not good at watching the girls. Marina is climbing the royal equivalent of the corporate ladder, and has found herself stuck as a glorified nanny for a bunch of unhappy teenagers. When she gets a chance to sabotage Sebastian, she readily takes it, exposing him as a band leader in a secret nightclub. For a moment, Marina has the job she's been longing for, but when it sounds like there's a chance Triton might forgive Sebastian, she loses her mind. Not that there was much to lose in the first place. She goes out to kill Sebastian, yes, you heard that right, and Ariel too, since she'll be a witness. If you're saying, that sounds kind of extreme even for this story, you're right. I know these sequels were aimed squarely at children, and their characters often act illogically. It's just especially noticeable this time around. There are a few sad ironies to Marina. She wants power and assumes her public will adore her, but no one seems to know who she is. Also, during her very brief stint as Triton's attaché, she talks about how much productivity has gone up. If we assume this isn't a bold-faced lie, there's the possibility that Marina was actually better at the job than Sebastian, but she throws it away in a fit of madness. Aside from that coveted job, Marina's biggest love is fashion. She has a huge wardrobe of flashy, anachronistic outfits and an extensive set of wigs. She's bald. This gets shown off in her song, Just One Mistake. The songs were written by Janine Tesori, who is much better known for her theater work. Shows like Caroline or Change, Shrek, Fun Home, and Kimberly Akimbo. It's unfortunate that Marina ends up getting one of the weaker songs. It sounds like two separate songs mashed together, a jazzy piece and a flashy show tune style number. Neither section really gets a chance to develop or stay with you. I also have to ask, if Triton outlawed music, is Marina breaking the law by singing? Or does this not count in a musical theater, breaking into song is sometimes just a substitute for a normal conversation kind of thing? I'm giving this too much thought. In the underscore, composer Jim Dooley gives the villainess an equally flashy theme. It has a surprising Spanish flair, complete with castanets. I'm not sure why, but it definitely left more impression on me than her song. We also have Benjamin, Marina's assistant / manicurist. This big, adorable manatee, voiced by Jeff Bennett, tries to be Marina's conscience. Unfortunately, he's very soft-spoken, and in order to be Marina's voice of reason, you need to shout your lungs out. Benjamin's only real crime is seeing Marina going off the deep end, and presumably not telling anyone. There's really nothing else he could have done. He's one of those villain henchmen who desperately needs another job. There's not an evil bone in his squishy body, and barely any other characters interact with him or even seem to notice he's there. It seems kind of unfair that he winds up in the dungeon with Marina at the end, but at least he doesn't seem to mind all that much. Finally, we have Marina's pack of vicious electric eels. Unlike Flotsam and Jetsam, these creatures are totally feral. I like that each eel has its own unique facial design, and they didn't just lazily copy and paste a bunch of identical ones. I've knocked this movie quite a bit, but the animation is especially nice for a direct-to-video sequel. It was also notably Disney's final direct-to-video sequel. Still, when I think about Ariel's adventures before The Little Mermaid, I prefer the TV series. The first Little Mermaid show from 1992 takes place back under the sea. Notably, this is where the Kingdom of Atlantica got its name. The show introduced a number of new characters, good and bad alike. Ursula, despite making such a splash in the movie, didn't appear until the second season. Practically, I understand why they held off. If they had Ursula appear and subsequently get defeated too much, she'd retroactively seem like less of a threat. Also, if Ariel faced off against her too often, it wouldn't make any sense why she would trust her in the movie. The mermaid may have been desperate, but Ursula was also something of a stranger to her at that point. Still, it doesn't seem right to have the Little Mermaid without Ursula. The compromise appears to have been to limit the Sea Witch's appearances and have her working mostly in the background. Although her plans fail, Ursula never faces defeat on a major level. She usually just retreats in frustration, ready to come up with a new scheme. She goes head-to-head with Ariel on a couple occasions, but their interactions are kept incredibly brief. Otherwise, this would have taken away from the impact of Ariel's first proper meeting with Ursula in the movie. You could argue that Ursula's appearances here are setting the seeds for what's to come. She's established as constantly plotting against Triton, and now Ariel's on her radar. On that note, Ursula isn't quite as scary as she is later on. Her relationship with Flotsam and Jetsam is closer to your typical cartoon bad guy berating their sidekicks. The eels aren't on her good side like they are in the movie, and often get abused for no real reason. In one episode, she tests a magical stone on them, turning them both into worms. She doesn't make any effort to change them back, and the eels are only restored when the stone gets broken by the heroes. As for another thing, her poor unfortunate polyps are nowhere to be found. I wouldn't be surprised if the TV censors were behind that one. The closest thing we get are the aforementioned worms, which look more conventionally cute. Most interestingly, the series established Ursula's exact species. She's an octopun, a race of hostile tentacled merpeople who have battled Triton in the past. In one of their fiercest fights, Ursula secretly armed them with tridents of their own, bringing them very close to victory. Years later, she tries the same thing again, but history repeats itself, and the octopun army is driven back. This is, of course, probably only canonical in the versions where Ursula is not related to Triton. In the continuities where she's his sister, I assume the octopus side of the family is some strange recessive gene. Or, hey, maybe there's an octopun branch in the family tree. Ursula also received a new song in her first appearance. You Wouldn't Want to Mess With Me has her boast about her magical skills. The song was written by Randy Peterson and Kevin Quinn. These two are responsible for the other TV songs mentioned here, unless noted otherwise. With Ursula initially sidelined, it seemed like the original main villain for the show was the evil Manta, voiced by Tim Curry. According to his backstory, this monster was sealed away in a mountain by ancient merpeople. Centuries later, the Manta pretends to be an innocent, trapped little fish. Ariel, always with a kind heart, lets him free, unleashing the villain on Atlantica. His first act after years of imprisonment is to turn all the fish against each other. Evil Manta hates love, happiness, harmony, art, and music. He grows to hate Ariel especially, since she represents all those good things that unite ocean dwellers. In his next two appearances, Manta tries taking over the kingdom by force. In one of them, thanks to a series of misunderstandings and coincidences, everyone believes a human's boot that fell into the sea is a weapon of mass destruction even more powerful than the trident. Armed with this thingamajigger, as everyone calls it, the Manta is outgunned by Ariel, who comes in packing 2 boots. It's all very silly, but worth it to hear Kenneth Mars and Tim Curry say the word thingamajigger with as much gravitas as they possibly can. At this point, the evil Manta has been a somewhat generic villain who sticks out because of his intimidating character design, and of course the presence of Tim Curry. It's his final episode that really elevates the character when we meet his son, Little Evil, voiced by Bradley Pierce. To fully enjoy this episode, you need to ignore Evil Manta's backstory. If he's been trapped since ancient times, when did he have a now adolescent child? Is there a Manta mother, or do evil Mantas just divide like cells? Regardless, Little Evil lets us see the Manta's nurturing side. He'd never call it that, of course, since he says he hates love, but he really does truly love his child. The problem is, he's doing all he can to raise his son to be as evil as him, right down to singing an evil lullaby called Just Like Me. The Manta has really upped his game this time. He has an entire chamber of evil, full of nasty devices he uses to spread his wickedness. The most disturbing of all is the Brain Sponge, a vicious living sponge that feeds on imagination. When he rightfully worries that Ariel will be a good influence on Little Evil, the Manta sets the sponge loose on Little Mermaid. Ariel is loving as they come, but when she's backed into a corner, she tricks the sponge into going after the evil Manta instead. She's horrified when her plan works, but it's not like she had much of a choice. Even so, she and Little Evil save the Manta before the sponge can do any real damage. This was the last episode of the series, which might explain how they got away with having Ariel actually help kill the brain sponge. It's still a little shocking compared to the rest of the show. Most shocked of all is the Manta, who can't believe anyone would save him after all that. When we last see him, he's attempting to smile, although it seems a little difficult. Hopefully, this means the evil Manta will follow his son's example and stop being, well, evil. They'll have to change their names, but I like to think that Ariel really brought out the best in them. On the far less threatening side is Lobster, Mobster, and his sidekick, the Shrimp. The Lobster, voiced by Joe Alasky, is based on a 1930s gangster, complete with an Edward G. Robinson voice. Luckily for the citizens of Atlantica, he's not very good at being a bad guy. He has ambition, see? But he lacks the skill, size, and brains to pull them off. Now, he's not totally hopeless. Of course, he has claws. I wouldn't want to tangle with a lobster in real life myself. It's his weapon of choice that leaves a bit to be desired. The bubble gun is more annoying than threatening. Even less scary is the Shrimp, voiced by David L. Lander. He's downright cuddly, and all the cunning that Lobster lacks, well, Shrimp's missing it doubly. It seems that Shrimp is Lobster's only henchman because everyone else sees his boss for the failure he is. Although they've gotten a couple lucky breaks, the duo will probably never rise above comic relief villain status. They did manage to pull off a pair of fun little songs. The Lobster Mobster's Mob, music by Michael Silvershire and lyrics by Ted Anosti and Patsy Cameron, is sung to entice Urchin, an orphan merboy, to join their team. Urchin ends up wisely choosing to go off with Ariel and Flounder instead, but the villains certainly make the life of crime sound enticing to a wayward youth. Their other song, Da Betty Bye Blues, comes when they kidnap a pair of babies for ransom. The infants grow on the bad guys pretty quickly, and there's a certain tenderness to the song underneath all the old-timey gangster jokes. The show introduces a number of species at war with Atlantica, but the only recurring one is the Sharkanians, the shark equivalent of mermaids. They may have more anthropomorphic qualities than Glut, but they're still fierce and somewhat simple-minded. They only want to conquer. Their leader is Emperor Sharga, voiced by Jim Cummings. He seems to be based on Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, judging by his general appearance, the Marlon Brando voice, and his tendency to crouch in the shadows with his hands on his face. Whether or not it was the original intention, Sharga ended up becoming a nemesis for Sebastian. In their first appearance, Sebastian's boasting gets him sent over as a peace ambassador. The sharks try to take advantage of the obviously inexperienced crab and have him deliver a trap to King Triton, but Ariel and Flounder manage to outwit them first. In their second appearance, Sebastian pretends to be king in order to impress his parents. You know, one of those plots. The Sharkanians decide that having a little crab on the throne would be the perfect time for an invasion, and once again, Sebastian needs to be bailed out by the merpeople. Boy, neither episode shows him in a good light. Our final recurring villain is Moray the Eel, voiced by Dave Coulier. He's certainly more harmless than, say, Ursula's own Moray eels. This slippery character is more of a pest. Most of the time, he sells whatever junk he can get his coils on. Sometimes it's legitimate, other times it's useless. Moray is an interesting case, because he's not overtly evil to the same degree as the other villains. Ariel and friends regard him with a bit of suspicion, but they keep coming back to him regardless. I think that says more about the trusting nature of the good guys than Moray. He's ultimately out for no one but himself, but I feel like if he had to choose between good and evil, he'd choose evil with little hesitation. He did steal the Triton once, which is practically a villain rite of passage under the sea. I think that definitely counts for something. Next to Ariel herself, the most popular character to emerge from Little Mermaid was probably Sebastian. During the production of the Little Mermaid TV show, Sebastian actually had his own cartoon series. These aired as a segment within another Disney show, Marsupilami. These shorts took things in a wackier direction. Sebastian was now living in modern times, getting into trouble as usual. Also brought over was Chef Louie. Disney clearly recognized how wonderfully madcap the chase scenes in the original movie were, and tried to replicate them a few times. It's still a little strange seeing them in present day, but I suppose the snooty French chef stereotype is one of the things that we still see now, so it's not the biggest stretch in the world. In one especially meta episode, Sebastian negotiates with a sleazy agent about getting his own show. This ends up being a cooking show with Louie as his first guest. Things go predictably haywire. Several other genres are attempted, with Louie crashing the party each time. Even their Star Trek-style show has an alien Louie attacking Sebastian's ship. The fed-up crab decides to prioritize his dignity, not to mention safety, and leaves the set. At the end, He sees that they've just given Louis his own show with seemingly no strings attached, making Sebastian regret his decision. Most of his battles with Louis either end in a draw or with Sebastian coming out on top. This is possibly Louis' only real victory in the entire franchise. In 2024, Disney Junior premiered Ariel, a preschool version of the story. Every incarnation of The Little Mermaid seems to be in its own slightly different continuity, but this one probably deviates the most. Ariel only has 2 older sisters, there are several new characters, and most importantly for this video, Ursula is a kind, benevolent sea witch. Tanti Ursula, voiced by Amber Riley, is still Triton's sister, but there's absolutely no bad blood between them. Now she uses her magic for good, and acts as a loving, playful mentor to Ariel and her friends. Flotsam and Jetsam have been renamed Ebb and Flow, and are given their own cuddly redesigns. Like in the remake, they don't speak anymore, and instead just make little chittering noises sometimes. Given that this is a completely non-villainous Ursula, and that the series is aimed at small children, I won't dwell on this one anymore and move on to something especially obscure. Long before the CGI Ariel series, there was an earlier attempt at a Little Mermaid show purely made for a young audience. The Little Mermaid's Island was proposed by Jim Henson when he started working with Disney. Muppet Studios made some nice-looking puppets, but Henson didn't work on the show beyond this, and was reportedly disappointed with the 2 episodes that were actually filmed. Neither of them ever aired, but they've turned up online. Instead of making Ursula a friendly character, the show omitted her entirely. The antagonist duties went to ARIEL'S, who caused mischief in both episodes. They make Sebastian doubt his friends care about him in the obligatory surprise party story. In the other episode, they trick Flounder into making a mess of Ariel's pearls. Then, they encourage him to lie about what happened, all while stealing a couple pearls for themselves. They even get their own song about lying to drive home just how untrustworthy they are. The puppets look nice, but there's a reason Henson wasn't all that impressed by this production. The Once Upon a Time TV series actually had 2 versions of Ursula. The first one is a goddess. For most of her screen time, it's not really her, but instead Regina, the evil queen, disguising herself to manipulate Ariel. Regina doesn't even believe Ursula actually exists until she comes face to face with the real deal. A statue of Ursula comes to life and warns the queen never to pull something like that again. This version is voiced by Yvette Nicole Brown. The second Ursula is a mermaid named after the sea goddess. In her youth, she served her father, Poseidon, by acting as a siren, luring sailors to their deaths. Like Ariel, Ursula's mother was killed by humans, and Poseidon's hated them ever since. After a number of adventures and heartbreaks, she rejects her mermaid form and turns her body into an octopus. She goes on to team up with Maleficent and Cruella de Vil. The adult Ursula is played by Maren Dungy, while the younger version is played by Tiffany Boone. She even gets to sing a few bars of Fathoms Below in her first appearance. In the Descendants franchise, the villains have all been banished to the Isle of the Lost. Ursula, no stranger to being banished, has opened a seafood restaurant. We only ever catch a glimpse of one of her enormous tentacles and hear a brief bit of voice acting from Whoopi Goldberg. The focus is on her daughter, Uma, played by China Anne McClain. Bitter at being left to rot on the island, unlike a few lucky villain kids, Uma serves as the main villain of Descendants 2. The friction continues in Descendants 3, but she eventually makes peace with the others. By the 4th movie, Rise of Red, Uma has fully come over to the good side and is now the head mistress of Auradon Prep. That movie also introduces Ursula's sister, Uliana, played by Dara Renee. When she was a teenager, she ran with villains like Maleficent, Hades, and Captain Hook, more or less acting as the gang's leader. Why they didn't just use Ursula herself is beyond me. What's also beyond me is why they had to invent a new sister in the first place. Ursula already has Morgana, and Uliana is also trying to live up to Ursula's legacy. It feels like an extra layer of complexity. I mean, maybe it's because one of her teenage villain friends is Morgy, son of Morgana Le Fay, and they didn't want 2 Morganas. But then why wouldn't they call the characters Mordred and Morgan Le Fay, especially since those are the actual characters' names from a public domain story and... Okay, I shouldn't get too worked up over this. One of the eels, presumably Jetsam based on his eye, guards Uliana's massive anglerfish hideout. He's a lot bigger than he was in The Little Mermaid. Speaking of, in the books, Flotsam and Jetsam have a child each, Logan and Derelict. This makes me wonder, who are their mothers? How many female Moray eels are on the Isle of the Lost? We never really hear about anyone's spouses. Who's Mr. Ursula? What's Mrs. Jafar like? Am I the only one who thinks about this? Maybe. Sorry, I said I wouldn't get too worked up, and then I did. Again. Well, that means I should probably move on to the next section. The inevitable stage musical version of the story had Alan Menken collaborate with Glenn Slater on new songs, along with bringing back the classic ones from the movie. Although the script expands on certain scenes, and switches the order a few moments, it generally follows the movie's plot pretty closely. The biggest change comes near the end, since having the Kraken-sized Ursula get skewered by a ship would have been difficult to do on stage. Here, Ursula never transforms into Vanessa. Instead, Eric holds a contest for all the eligible maidens to sing in hopes that one of them is his mystery woman. He finally realizes that the Cinderella idea is silly and that Ariel's the only one for him, even if she can't speak. Ursula crashes the party at the last minute, dragging Ariel back into the ocean. The final confrontation is more dialogue-heavy, with Ariel having to choose whether or not to trust her smothering father or her sketchy aunt. It's not a hard choice, and Ariel smashes Ursula's magic shell, which was apparently the source of all her powers. The sea witch withers away, her eels flee, and a happy ending is had by everyone else. Several new songs were written for Ursula, but not all of them were used. 3 were considered at different points for her introduction scene. She was originally going to be introduced with Wasting Away, based on a line she has in the movie. A lot of emphasis was put on how much weight she's lost, but the irony didn't really work when the slender Sherry Renee Scott was cast in the role. The lyrics relied a little too heavily on repeating the same joke anyway. When the show premiered on Broadway, Ursula sang I Want the Good Times Back. It had the same vibe as Wasting Away, but we got some backstory about Ursula and Triton. On his deathbed, their father, Poseidon, gave Triton his trident and Ursula his magic shell. He gave each of them half the ocean, but Ursula's dabbling in black magic, not to mention her other evil tendencies, resulted in her banishment and Triton taking over the rest of the sea. In the revised version of the show, the one that's most commonly staged, Ursula's backstory is tweaked even more. Now, she sings Daddy's Little Angel, which has a similar tune to Wasting Away, but wildly different lyrics. This one's about how she was the youngest of 7 sisters, creating an interesting parallel between her and Ariel, right down to them feeling like their father liked their sisters better. Ursula brags about how she killed her sisters one by one, but made them look like accidents. She was so focused on rubbing out the girls that she didn't realize that her baby brother, Triton, was the real threat. He ended up being her father's favorite, and ultimately Ursula's downfall. All 3 songs have the same purpose. First, they introduce our bitter, vengeful villain and her sidekicks. Near the end of all 3, she decides that Ariel is the way to take down her brother, and the bad guys eagerly anticipate putting their plan into action. Both Good Times and Daddy's Little Angel are reprised in their respective versions when Ursula orders her eels to break up the Kiss the Girl scene. For what it's worth, out of the 3, my favorite is I Want the Good Times Back. Speaking of Flotsam and Jetsam, they've been written as electric eels like the later remake. The pair have their own sneaky little number, Sweet Child, which they sing to entice Ariel. The tune is similar to the theme Menken wrote for them in the movie, but it's not exactly note for note. In fact, the original theme was going to be used at a few points in Wasting Away. The Broadway run had them sing a gloating little reprise after they stopped Ariel and Eric from kissing, but the revival cuts it for time. Similarly, the pre-Broadway tryout had Ursula singing a reprise of Eric's song, Her Voice, as she anticipates the final sunset, but it was cut by the time the cast album was recorded. It seems that in the early drafts of the script, Ursula was still going to turn into Vanessa. She had a reprise of Poor Unfortunate Souls where she made a new potion. She also had a totally new song called All Good Things Must End, a deliciously evil number about how nothing good ever lasts. I can imagine her singing this in disguise and having Scuttle overhear. When the ending was reworked, Ursula gets a different Poor Unfortunate Souls reprise as she forces Triton to sign the contract. The Broadway Ursula is handled somewhat differently. This is typically a louder, broader take on the character, which is fitting for a theatrical production. The original Ursula always had sneaky, oily tendencies, but the show ramps up that sleazy, used car salesman persona. My favorite new moment is where she describes herself and Ariel as gals with ambition, the kind that Triton could never understand. Like the Daddy's Little Angel song, this serves as a link between the characters. Ursula is only trying to gain Ariel's trust so that she can trick her, but she's technically correct. It's a brilliant bit of character writing, and I almost wish they had used it in the original movie. One of the biggest changes to Ursula's role in the story came in the revised version. This time, not only has Ursula done away with her and Triton's sisters, but she's also revealed to have killed Ariel's mother and blamed humans. Honestly, I'm not crazy about that plot point. I prefer Triton's hatred of humans coming from the fact that they pose a danger to merpeople and all the fish in the ocean. While this is still true in all versions of the story, I think that having there be a deeply personal reason with Ariel's mother, one that ends up not even being true, actually takes away from the conflict more than it adds. I like the idea of Triton focusing on the big picture and not his personal loss. He's scared enough of losing Ariel, and I think that's already a good emotional drive. Interestingly, in a tie-in novel written for the live-action film, Against the Tide, Ursula is also revealed to be responsible for the mother's death. I actually prefer this version, since they don't have the Sea Witch directly kill her, but instead lure her to an area full of hunters who do it themselves. That way, they still worked Ursula into things, but put the ultimate responsibility on humans. As for dangerous humans, look no further than Chef Louis. The stage version appears to redeem him, since he doesn't actively go after Sebastian in the final scene, but he's still worth mentioning. Les Poissons was completely cut from the remake, since they decided that the cartoony mayhem would simply not work in live action. On stage, you can get away with that kind of thing a little more easily. The song is expanded as the entire kitchen staff present Ariel with plate after plate of cooked fish. Les Poissons always felt like the building blocks for Be Our Guest from Beauty and the Beast, and the new version really plays that up. Out of all the new lyrics, I think this is the closest Glenn Slater comes to perfectly mimicking Ashman's style, happily listing all the fish on the menu and having lines like, "If it's gilled, it's been grilled to a T." Sebastian makes his daring escape in the end, leading to some carefully choreographed chaos. In 2019, ABC screened a special live version of the movie. Well, partially live. Interspersed with a slightly cut-down version of the animated film were live celebrity performances of all the songs, plus a couple from the musical. Queen Latifah is easily the highlight as Ursula. The set is decked out to look like a grand-scale version of her lair, complete with puppet versions of Flotsam, Jetsam, and some especially cute polyps. What's most interesting is that Ursula's conversation with Ariel has been rewritten in song. The lyrics are only credited to Howard Ashman, but I can't find out who wrote the new material. I don't think it was Glenn Slater. If anything, they sound like the work of Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was also working with Menken on new songs for the remake. I honestly thought we were getting a preview for something from that movie, but none of them ended up getting used. If this isn't Miranda, it's someone doing a pretty good impression. Vanessa's version of Poor Unfortunate Souls was expanded, with entirely new lyrics for Ursula. I think out of all the Disney villain songs, this one has gotten the most different versions over the years. It's quite impressive. The Les Poissons performance, with John Stamos playing Louis, was honestly a little too ambitious. The cartoonishly violent nature is captured well for the most part, but then it gets kinda silly when a bunch of people in crab costumes start fighting back. The silliness ramps up when the audience, who are all given crab claws, starts snapping at Louis, who in turn tries to season them. In the end, all the chefs are rounded up into a giant cooking pot themselves. It's hard to tell what you're supposed to focus on with all the mayhem. Even the camera crew seems a little confused. While it's nice hearing the new Broadway lyrics get worked in, the whole thing ironically had too many cooks in the kitchen. Several books have given us their own interpretations of a younger Ursula, along with her motivations. Disney Villain's Secret Files by Jeff Curdy shows a thinner but still greedy Ursula making a mess of things at the royal buffet table, and later reeling in jealousy at Triton's coronation. Once Upon a Princess and My Side of the Story both portray Ursula as being in love with His Majesty, which is one of her prime motivations for trying to take over. My Side of the Story by Daphne Skinner is told from a humorous, tongue-in-cheek angle where Ursula rationalizes her evil deeds, or outright blames them on a split personality. She assures us that after the battle with Eric, bad Ursula is gone, leaving only her alleged good side. Meanwhile, Once Upon a Princess has another look at the younger Ursula, who tried to overthrow Triton when he chose Ariel's mother over her. Hell hath no fury like a sea witch scorned. She tried to spread rumors that Triton was allying himself with humans, but she was banished before they could get any traction. I think it's interesting that they specifically say that Ursula was once a member of Ariel's mother's royal court, meaning either Triton married into royalty, or both parents had their own kingdoms. I never really thought about the details before this. In the novel Reflections of Ursula by Marilyn Kay, Ursula disguises herself as a lovely young mermaid and manages to weasel her way back into the royal palace. She gains the trust of all Triton's daughters, and then turns them against each other through subtle manipulation. Just like what happened with Scuttle in the movie, Ursula's true identity is revealed through a reflection. That certainly explains the title. The Disney Chills series by Vera Strange has been described as Disney's take on Goosebumps. Essentially, scary stories for the middle school crowd, often with a nasty twist ending. The first book, Part of Your Nightmare, takes place in modern times at the seaside town of Triton Bay. Shelley Anderson, our protagonist, is going through a lot. Her parents have separated, and she's having trouble making friends at her new school. As adults, we know these are all problems that can be overcome, but when you're a kid dealing with all these stressors, you don't have the benefit of hindsight. It doesn't help that the crowd Shelley's trying to roll with are not really all that nice. The girl is miserable, lonely, and depressed. The perfect target for a certain sea witch. The story really runs with the horror genre. It never gets too intense for its intended audience, but it puts Shelley through the ringer and has one of the darker takes on Ursula that I've read. She's largely kept in the shadows, and doesn't really put on a nice guy act like she does with some of her other victims. She really puts the pressure on Shelley to make a deal, and that's because she needs the girl. Shelley is more than just a polyp in waiting, she's a pawn in a much bigger plan. They especially highlight Ursula's manipulative nature in how everything Shelley does unwittingly plays into Ursula's designs. Moving on, the Twisted Tales series takes the classic stories in a different direction by changing one of the movie's key events. In Part of Your World, by Liz Broswell, we see what would happen if Ariel never defeated Ursula. In this continuity, Ariel has been made the new ruler of Atlantica in her father's place, and her voice remains stolen. Ursula, meanwhile, has decided that humans are more fun to play with, and remains on land as Vanessa using Ariel's voice. Eric stays in a trance, and Vanessa has been waging war on neighboring kingdoms to gain even more power. It's the kind of thing she was never able to do under the sea. Flotsam and Jetsam continue to serve her, now in creepy human form. As it turns out, her magic powers gradually wane on land. Eric slowly comes out of his hypnosis and begins to remember Ariel and his very strange wedding day. Ariel, in turn, finds out that Triton is not dead like everyone assumed, but is being kept prisoner in polyp form by the Sea Witch. Together, Ariel and Eric work to regain the stolen voice, free Triton, and save the kingdom from Ursula's rule. The story offers some interesting takes on the characters. Ariel, at one point, realizes that Ursula might resent her for personal reasons. She has to sit around being banished, while the princess is beautiful, royalty, loved by all, and has an amazing voice. Sure, she's got everything. Although it veers into some slight fanfiction territory at a few points, including some business with the Lovecraft Elder Gods, there's clearly a lot of care put into this. I'm definitely going to check out the other installments in future videos. On a similar note is the Tale of series by Serena Valentino, which tells the stories from the villain's point of view. They also add a number of new characters and motivations. In Poor Unfortunate Soul, A Tale of the Sea Witch, we learn about Ursula's backstory. She was abandoned as a child and brought up by a lonely fisherman. The people of his village didn't appreciate him harboring a fish person and killed him. Ursula later took revenge on the entire town, wiping it out. At that point, King Triton rose from the sea and revealed himself as her brother. He took her back to the royal court, but insisted she take on the form of a mermaid instead of her classic octopus look. One of her only friends was Queen Athena, who actually tried to stand up for her. Interesting how this story takes the opposite route of the versions where Ursula is responsible for Athena's death. Nevertheless, Triton and Ursula fought constantly, with Ursula eventually getting banished and becoming the reclusive sea witch we know and love. Not since Ariel's beginning have I seen such an unsympathetic version of King Triton. We find out that he was actually the one who abandoned little Ursula in the first place. He only goes to find Ursula later because in order for him to take the throne, he needs to prove that she's unworthy. Losing or being betrayed by everyone she's ever loved is ultimately what turns Ursula into a villain, but there's another factor this time. The Odd Sisters, a trio of witches who work with Ursula to locate their missing sister, Circe. This is book 3 in a series of stories allegedly about the Disney villains. I hadn't read the first two, so I was a little lost on the Odd Sisters material. The problem is, their story takes up so much of the book that it feels like Ursula is more of a supporting character. I can't judge the series solely on this book, but it almost feels like the author wanted to write a fantasy series about witches and had to shoehorn in the Disney characters in order to get it published. Based on my research, it seems like these witches have played a hand in the corruption of numerous Disney villains, which kind of takes some of the bad guys' bite away. Maybe I shouldn't be making assumptions about the author yet. She seems like a Disney fan, even including reference to Harold as one of the polyps. I just can't get over how the alleged tale of a sea witch only has the witch present for about half the story. I'll see if my opinion changes as I read more of the series. I was unable to get my hands on a copy of Disney Villains Happily Never After by Lori Langdon, but it's another book talking about Ursula's early years. The story has her going to the surface for the first time in her Vanessa disguise. It makes sense that she's been there before. In the movie, Vanessa carries herself much more gracefully than Ariel. You're not going to catch her combing her hair with a fork. Many comics have been written about Ariel, mostly focusing on her adventures before the movie. They appear to be in the same continuity as the TV series. Ursula appears much more frequently than she did in the cartoon, always scheming to take the throne. Flotsam and Jetsam get an equal time in the spotlight, frequently spying on Ariel or sometimes antagonizing her on their own. The comics tended to make the eels a little clumsier and sillier than the movie. Ariel seems to have gotten used to how often the characters spy on her, since she uses it to her advantage at least once. When she finds an oil spill, she loudly talks about having to hide the treasure from Ursula. The eels overhear her, and Ursula magically takes the oil herself, cleaning up that part of the ocean. Because of the lighthearted nature of the comics, Ursula doesn't pack the same punch as she normally does. Her wicked plots still carry some weight, but when you see her get comically defeated again and again, it starts to rob her of her dignity. It's basically the same thing I said when I talked about Shere Khan and Ratigan, and it's probably why Maleficent, one of the most threatening Disney villains, never made as many appearances in comics. It also sort of works against what the writers of the TV series accomplished, where they were careful not to have Ursula interact with Ariel too much. Still, if I was writing comics about The Little Mermaid, I would have a hard time resisting the urge to put Ursula in them. Ursula's strangest comic appearance deserves a short rundown of its own. In a story that takes place vaguely during the original movie, Ariel is dreaming of Eric. Triton, who knows Eric by name, can't stand for this and needs something to distract her. Sebastian suggests a beauty contest with a human thing as a prize. Triton hates human things almost as much as humans themselves, but concedes. The prize will be a sword he found. Ursula, spying as always, recognizes the sword as the legendary Excalibur. In order to get it, she disguises herself as a beautiful mermaid, incognita from the Black Sea. Instead of looking like Vanessa, she sort of resembles Krista from Ferngully. I think it's the hair. Likewise, she turns Flotsam and Jetsam into a pair of less threatening fish. Incognita wins the pageant, but just as she's about to claim the sword, its rightful owner appears. Merlin himself drops in and reveals Ursula's trick. Since he's taking the sword, he gives the runner-up, Ariel, her own special prize, a picture of Eric. Cue a very grouchy King Triton. There are a lot of reasons I love doing these videos, but one of my favorite parts is finding something obscure and crazy, and then getting to share it with everyone. Quite a few characters from the TV series return in the comics, like Lobster, Mobster, and Shrimp. In their most notable story, Lobster fires the Shrimp. The little henchman doesn't know where to go next, but he stumbles upon a magnifying lens that makes him appear bigger than he's ever been to other fish. Shrimpy likes feeling like a big shot for a change, and passes himself off as a fearsome sea monster. Ariel sees right through the disguise and actually takes pity on him. It must be hard feeling so small all the time. At the end of the story, the Shrimp surprisingly does not return to Lobster, but actually gets appointed as a crossing guard for even smaller shrimp. I like to hope that any other appearances take place before this, and that the little shrimp actually found a happy ending. He really didn't cut it as a bad guy anyway. The evil Manta returned as well. He didn't appear as frequently, but one story had him overhear Ursula talking about a treasure hidden in a sunken ship. The Manta goes after the treasure himself, only to find that Lobster and Shrimp have gotten there first. The whole thing was actually a trap set by the Sea Witch to capture Ariel, but it's the other bad guys who end up getting ensnared. Triton doesn't take kindly to this, and chases everyone away with his trident. As of this video, I believe this is the only comic where all these villains appeared in the same story. The Sharkanians actually played a large role in a very lore-heavy story exploring the history of Atlantica. It was once the legendary city of Atlantis. The merpeople lived in the city's bay, and a race of centaurs lived on land. The species got along decently, but generally kept their distance. Meanwhile, the Mermaid King wanted his daughter to marry a Sharkanian prince in order to bring their kingdoms together, but the mermaid was in love with a centaur instead. The sharks got revenge by tampering with a volcano, causing destruction to rain down on Atlantis. The Sharkanian king even tried to steal the trident and take over what was left of the kingdom. They were ultimately defeated, but Atlantis was gone. With no land to live on, the centaurs flew to Mount Olympus, where they still live to this day. Now, once in every generation, a mermaid is born who thinks differently and loves the surface world. Even Chef Louis got into the act every now and then. I don't think they could ever replicate his original scene with Sebastian, but they certainly tried in one story. This time, Louis is planning on cooking a lobster. Scuttle is sent in to rescue her, and succeeds in his own bumbling way. Once again, Louis is the victim of cartoon slapstick. For a while, Flounder was the only animal sidekick who managed to avoid the chef, but eventually even he had a close call. Louis captures the fish for a special meal, leading Sebastian and Ariel to go on their own rescue mission. I'm sure this wasn't the intended takeaway, but now I'm curious about how Flounder tastes. The two-part Serpentine story introduces a new set of villains, the Moray, a hostile race of merpeople. Instead of being half fish, they are half electric eel. These creatures live behind a dark veil of ink and have their own shut-off little society. During one of her regular disobeying her father jaunts, Ariel gets caught by these serpents and zapped unconscious by their bratty princess, Celia. Celia embodies some of Ariel's worst traits. Like Ariel, she's headstrong and often ignores the rules and wishes of others if she doesn't like them. Unfortunately, she lacks the mermaid's good traits, like her love and compassion. In their isolated kingdom, the Moray believe merpeople are extinct, and that Ariel is the last of her kind. Celia decides to keep her as a pet, despite Ariel's very vocal protests. Her father, King Cornelius, is a terrible influence and shares his daughter's attitude. Only the queen has a level head, but she's often disregarded by her awful family. The Moray believe there's nothing beyond the ink that surrounds their kingdom. In order to satisfy his own violent urges, the king has a yearly event where his warriors are sent into a labyrinth with a serpentine, a gigantic sea monster. Essentially, an underwater version of King Minos' maze. Ariel's sister, Aquata, gets captured as well and put in the labyrinth. She escapes, and although the serpentine has to be killed when it gets loose, now the Moray know there are more merpeople out there. Cornelius decides to wage war on Atlantica. They've been itching to do something like this for generations. In fact, according to King Triton, this is the second time war between the kingdoms has happened. Ursula, always looking for a chance at power, allies herself with the Moray and feeds them information on Triton. In return, she takes the dead serpentine off their hands. Her ultimate goal is to have the Moray defeat Triton and then steal his crown and Triton from them. Triton winds up victorious, but Ursula is happy to at least have gotten a new lair out of the deal. There will be other opportunities to take over the kingdom in the future. This is also the only kind of explanation we've gotten for what exactly the skeleton that Ursula now lives inside was. Of course, when it comes to the supplemental materials, we all tend to pick and choose what we consider canonical, but I like the story. Celia swears vengeance, but the Morays are never seen again. The closest thing we saw was a singular Eel Mermaid character voiced by Scott Menville, who briefly appeared in the TV series. Finally, we have Kilala Princess. I've covered this one a few times before, but for the sake of consistency, it's a manga following Kilala, a major Disney princess fangirl who finds herself journeying through her idol stories. In the Little Mermaid section, Kilala's love interest, Prince Ray, gets kidnapped by Ursula. The Sea Witch has decided that she's more deserving of him than our heroine, and plans to marry the prince herself. This version of Ursula is more physically violent than we're used to, striking Kilala with her tentacles at several points. With encouragement from Ariel, Kilala is able to defeat the villainess and rescue her prince. With such an exciting final battle in the movie, a character like Ursula is a natural for video games. Being such a massive franchise, The Little Mermaid has spawned many games of its own, not to mention the characters making countless appearances in other Disney games. We'll cover the ones based solely on the movie first, and then branch out to those other ones. The first Little Mermaid game was for the Nintendo. It functions as sort of an alternate universe version of the story, where Ursula made Ariel human, she got engaged to Eric, and that was apparently that. Shortly before their wedding, Ariel's friends tell her that Ursula has hypnotized most of the other fish and is gearing up to take over the whole ocean. Ariel reveals her true identity to Eric, somehow turns back into a mermaid, and goes off to defeat the Sea Witch. Because of Ursula's influence, many otherwise friendly sea creatures attack Ariel. Some of them, like Glut and the eels, would have attacked her anyway. Original bosses include a walrus, and my favorite new character, Soldierfish. He sits atop a little sunken ship and fires urchins out of its cannons. That's delightful. It's a shame they never used him in the cartoon or comics. Ursula has upgraded from the skeleton lair to a maze-like castle. She still has a few polyps hanging around. You need that trademark Sea Witch interior decorating after all. Ariel fights her twice, once in her normal form, and again as a giant. The sea is saved, and everyone, of course, lives happily ever after. Ariel the Little Mermaid for SEGA is interesting. Despite the title, players can choose either the Little Mermaid herself or King Triton as their playable character. Ursula has really let Atlantica have it this time, and has turned seemingly everyone into polyps. If you like these wriggly little creatures, this game is for you. Actually, maybe it's not, because your mission is to turn them all back into merpeople. If the players choose Ariel, they have to rescue her father, and if they choose Triton, they have to rescue his daughter. Ferocious sharks patrol the waters, but the sunken ship level has one that's twice as big lurking inside, so I think we can assume this one is Glut. Speaking of Glut, he gets to make an appearance outside the Mermaid franchise in the world of Illusion. Mickey or Donald face the shark where else but in the sunken ship. His main attack, chomping his way across the floor, is taken straight from the movie. Ariel's Story Studio was part of the great interactive storybook craze of the 90s. There's a surprising deal of new material here, with most of the original voice actors returning and recording original lines. Pat Carroll gets the most as Ursula, of course, but Patty Edwards gets some new dialogue as the Eels, and even Jodie Benson gets to play Vanessa again.
Let's get this wedding over with!
Ariel, Sebastian, and Ursula take turns narrating the story and giving their own commentary. For instance, when Glut almost eats flounder in this version, Ursula cheers him on.
Yes, go for the fish. The mermaid's all mine.
Haha, we'll see about that, Ursula.
Another unique moment comes at the end. Instead of dying, Ursula turns into a little purple polyp upon her defeat. The Game Boy Advance Magic in Two Kingdoms has a few somewhat unique character appearances. There's the expected final battle with the giant Ursula, which has Eric firing cannons at her tentacles. Flotsam and Jetsam do one of the most heinous things possible in a video game, forcing Ariel to swim through rings, Superman 64 style. Meanwhile, Sebastian needs to avoid Louie in the kitchen, saving other crabs along the way. There's also a level dedicated to distracting Vanessa and destroying her magic shell before the wedding. Ariel's Undersea Adventure for the DS has the mermaid investigating a number of water surges that have been happening all over the kingdom. Ursula and her eels watch her from a distance. Flotsam and Jetsam try to lure her into a trap near the end, but nothing really comes from it. Ursula vows to keep a closer eye on Ariel in the future, somewhat setting up the events of the movie. As for the water surges, it turns out Ursula's to blame as well. She turned Puff, a little fish who is self-conscious about his size, into an enormous pufferfish who accidentally causes the surges when he expands and deflates. This might be one of the only times when someone's deal with Ursula didn't blow up in their face. It blows up in everyone else's. Ariel finds a good use for Puff's abilities in Sebastian's hot crustacean band, and all is well in the ocean. The Little Mermaid 2 for the PlayStation actually adapted the original movie and its sequel. The first section follows Ariel through her adventure, meeting the usual enemies along the way. The Ursula battle is done entirely differently from the movie. This time, it's in the Sea Witch's lair. Ursula zaps Ariel with the trident, and the mermaid must use the witch's potions against her. Near the end of the second section, Melody jumps her way up Morgana's ice tower and takes on Sea Witch number 2. Avoiding blasts from the trident, Melody pelts her with shards of ice. On a similar note, Pinball Frenzy for the Game Boy Color also has sections based on both movies, meaning both Ursula and Morgana appear at different points in the game. The Disney Princess game for the Game Boy Advance has a mermaid section where Ursula is up to her usual tricks. First, her eels kidnap Sebastian and imprison him in a sunken ship. Armed with the trident, Ariel battles sharks, pufferfish, and eels to save her friend. When they return to the kingdom, they find that the Sea Witch has captured several merpeople, including Triton, and has turned them into polyps in her lair. Much like the SEGA game, Ariel swims around, restoring her people before battling Ursula herself. My Fairytale Adventure for the Wii features what is possibly the most unintentionally scary version of Ursula we'll ever see. Most of the game appears to be aimed at a very young audience. The focus is almost solely on the princesses and their animal sidekicks, with only a few exceptions. In the Little Mermaid section, at one point the player needs to help Flounder. He's found the statue of Prince Eric, but Flotsam and Jetsam have taken it to Ursula's lair, presumably to lure Ariel. Ursula, who appears to have recently gotten a botched Botox job, is gloating to her eels. The player needs to stealthily avoid the Sea Witch in order to get the statue. The Cinderella level features a similar section with Lucifer, the only other villain in the game. I really can't take my eyes off Ursula here for all the wrong reasons. It's like they crossed her with Slimer from Ghostbusters. On the theme park side of video gaming, Ursula was just one of many to appear in the Magic Kingdom's mobile game. In her storyline, the kingdom has turned Ariel back into a mermaid. I assume this is to reflect how at the Disney parks, you're more likely to see Ariel in her mermaid form rather than a human, although it's not impossible. Opportunistic Ursula takes credit for the transformation, hoping to bluff her way into stealing the trident in return for giving Ariel her legs back. Once again, Scuttle ends up being her undoing. The seagull overhears the Sea Witch gloating to herself and alerts the others. In a separate section, Ursula considers trying to add Maleficent to her polyp collection, but wisely decides that this would be a very bad move. She also tries to find some replacement familiars, since in this game, Flotsam and Jetsam are still apparently dead. As of right now, she's still looking. There are quite a few other Ursula appearances out there, but I'm going to narrow it down to just a couple more. Dreamlight Valley is particularly notable, since it marked the last time Pat Carroll voiced the character before her passing. Ursula can be seen in both her normal form and as Vanessa. She still sounds like Pat Carroll in both forms this time, since she no longer has Ariel's voice. In this game, the characters inhabit the titular valley and more or less get along, villains included. Ursula still schemes every now and then, but things are not as hostile as they could be. The racing game, Disney Speedstorm, should also be mentioned, since it gives Ursula a new voice actress, Deborah Wilson.
It's time I took matters into my own tentacles.
I have a feeling most of you want to hear about Kingdom Hearts, so I won't keep you waiting any longer. The first game has Ursula joining a team of elite Disney villains led by Maleficent, intent on taking over multiple worlds. The plot of the Atlantica section resembles the movie, but with some key differences. The biggest change is that it takes place entirely underwater, with no humans involved. Our heroes, Sora, Donald, and Goofy, travel to the kingdom to seal its keyhole to prevent the wicked Heartless from getting in. Ursula has already used some to cause chaos in the palace. Each hero gets a special fish form. Donald, the magic user, has become part octopus, perhaps meant to link him with Ursula, who's also well versed in spells. King Triton, extra paranoid at the monsters running amok, forbids Ariel from going out too far. The rebellious princess is tired of her father's orders, making her easy picking for the Sea Witch. Ursula says if Ariel sneaks her into the palace, she'll show the Little Mermaid new worlds. It's a trick, of course, and Ursula makes off with the trident, leaving an injured Triton in her wake. Ariel and the heroes go after Ursula, stopping to fight Glut along the way. Inside her lair, the way to beat Ursula is to attack her cauldron first, which will stun the Sea Witch. The battle takes the lives of the eels, but Ursula escapes again. The second battle has her use the Triton's powers, becoming a giant like in the movie. One of her attacks is inhaling the heroes Kirby style. After a long battle, Ursula is defeated, sinking down into the inky darkness. I should also mention that Flotsam and Jetsam are voiced by Corey Burton in this game. He would go on to voice them in future speaking appearances.
Wait, maybe she can be of some help. Yes, maybe she can be of some help to you.
Chain of Memories tells an alternate version of the first game's events, because this one takes place in Sora's dreams. The story has been even more simplified, omitting Triton, Flotsam, Jetsam, and Glut. This time, Ursula wants the trident in return for helping Ariel save Flounder from the humans. It turns out that Flounder has not been taken by fishermen, but by Ursula herself. The outcome is the same, with Sora and friends triumphing. Kingdom Hearts 2 takes things in a weird direction. For one thing, Ursula and the eels were for all intents and purposes killed in the first game. The sequel goes to great lengths to show how other slain villains, like Maleficent and Oogie Boogie, get resurrected, but it just brings Ursula and her minions back with no explanation. Also, the dialogue implies that Ariel doesn't remember how much trouble Ursula caused her in the past. Now, we directly follow the movie story. After Triton destroys Ariel's human things, the mermaid goes through the motions with Ursula. The most notable alteration in the sequel is that the gameplay changes entirely for Atlantica. The swimming controls in the first one are somewhat infamous, so this game changes the main objective to music-based rhythm games. As a result, this section has become divisive among fans. I actually thought the rhythm parts were plenty of finny fun myself, but I wish the original songs had been better. Case in point, Ursula's Revenge. After Sora exposes the Vanessa disguise by shooting the magic shell with his Keyblade, the story continues to play out like the movie. Ursula, gigantic once again, fights the heroes in song. Ursula's Revenge is a bombastic piece in a semi-operatic style, but it's not nearly as interesting as I'm making it sound. Now, out of the 3 original songs written for the Atlantica levels, it's probably the best. It's bland, but at least it's not actively annoying. Ursula comes back one more time in Dream Drop Distance. Or rather, her image does. A phantom version of Ursula is summoned as a tutorial boss to fight Sora and Riku. She appears to remember them and rants about revenge, but it's debatable how real this version of her is. It's been a little while since we've talked about Twisted Wonderland, but we're finally headed back to Night Raven College. We'll be focusing on the Octavanil House, made in honor of the legendary Sea Witch. The students admire her generous spirit, and how she would make magical deals with those in need, even if the price was steep. The head of the house is Azul Ashengrotto, voiced by Atushi Tamaru. He also runs the Mostro Lounge Cafe, which you may have noticed is one letter off from the Pinocchio whale. Azul is well known among his peers. Taking inspiration from the Sea Witch, he makes deals with students. In his main chapter, we find that many students are doing better than normally on exams. Azul has given them the world's greatest study guides, guaranteed to get them high marks. If they make it into the top 50 scores, they're in the clear. If not, they wind up with a magical anemone stuck to their heads, forced to do Azul's bidding for the rest of their time at the academy. Since hundreds of students bought into this, that means that only 50 of them made it out with their heads intact. The rest have to slave away for Azul and his boys. The boys in question are the Leech Twins, Floyd and Jade, voiced by Nobuhiko Okamoto and Wataru Kamada. The Slippery brothers love putting the squeeze on victims who won't pay up. They're a little more playful than the soft-spoken eels from the movie. When reading their dialogue, I imagine them sounding more like the ones in the stage musical. These three students actually hail from under the sea. When they're in the ocean, we get to see their true forms. Floyd and Jade are Moray merpeople, and Azul, of course, has the body of an octopus. In his childhood, Azul was bullied by the other merfolk for his appearance. This inspired him to work extra hard to improve himself. Some of it was achieved on his own merits, and some through making deals. For instance, he helped a merboy get a girlfriend, and as payment, he took the merboy's beautiful singing voice. When Azul's latest plan gets thwarted, he reverts back into his octo-self, consumed by anger. The main character has to snap him out of it, as he does for all the other corrupted characters. After the reality check, Azul gets a little nicer, but continues his shady business practices with the leeches. This time, they're somewhat less dishonest, but there's still a trace of villainy around the edges. Speaking of villainy, I recently got some very helpful information from Mewdove, correcting what I had said in a previous video. I had talked about how the overblotted characters were restored by their friends, with their good sides coming through. Mewdove shared the perspective of the game's creator, Yana Tsobo, who said that the students saving the overblotted boys are more selfish than pure-hearted. While the characters all grow and learn as the story goes on, they're not exactly good people. That's some interesting insight. I'll have to keep it in mind for future videos. During the period that The Little Mermaid was released, Disney's Imagineers found themselves having the same problem again and again. They would develop a big theme park attraction around one of their movies, but then the movie wouldn't do all that well, and the attraction would be totally scrapped. That's probably why the Black Cauldron boat ride never happened. Mermaid was exactly the success they were hoping for, but it took a long while before it received a proper ride. A dark ride was conceived for both Disneyland and Disneyland Paris in the early 90s, with a very impressive ride system. Guests would appear to sail in a boat on the water, but thanks to a mix of special effects, they were able to then dive under the sea and explore the ocean world. After partying with Sebastian, guests would pass their first sense of danger, Flotsam and Jetsam. One idea was to have the riders travel through a long tunnel with the eels beckoning them onward from different crevices. Ursula and her lair would, of course, have been a big centerpiece. This would lead directly back onto the surface, where a gigantic Ursula emerged out of the water. The ships would then appear to ram into her, putting guests in the shoes of Prince Eric. A CGI mock-up of the ride was shared on video releases of the movie, but I imagine it would have looked even better in person. There's also some concept art out there of a trackless variation, but that could very well be another story entirely. We finally got a Little Mermaid dark ride all the way in 2011. Ariel's Undersea Adventure opened in California Adventure, followed by an identical version in Florida in 2012. The only real difference is that Florida's ride has a more elaborate exterior and wait area and a real mouthful of a name. Under the Sea, Journey of the Little Mermaid. Catchy. But we're not here to poke fun at the marketing team. We're here to talk about Ursula. About halfway through the journey, guests enter the villain's lair with her eels leering down at them. Inside, a marvelous animatronic Ursula works at her cauldron as the glowing eyes of her victims blink in the darkness. While this ride doesn't quite reach the heights of the original concept, this section is a real highlight. Sadly, the final showdown with Ursula has been totally neutered. We see Ariel and Eric kissing, with the monster Ursula apparently dropping dead from anger in the background. I'm assuming someone thought the original climax would have been too scary. Perhaps, but I think the recent dark rides could use a scare or two. Even though it took ages to get a mermaid ride, there was never a shortage of Ariel in the theme parks. One of the earliest attractions was Voyage of the Little Mermaid at MGM Studios. Yes, it's Hollywood Studios now, but it will always be MGM in our hearts. The show retold the movie with a combination of actors, puppets, screens, and even laser effects. Roughly halfway through the show, Flotsam and Jetsam poke their heads out of a cavern as Ariel finishes her song. They give her their usual spiel, and out rolls a mammoth Ursula puppet. There have been a couple versions of this figure over the years. While the later versions were probably nicer to look at, I think the pupilless eyes of the original one were particularly scary. The videos do a decent job showing off her scale, and let me tell you, she was pretty intimidating when I saw her in person as a kid. Ursula sings her Poor Unfortunate song, and strikes a bargain with Ariel. The early versions of the show actually had some grasping hands appear from the darkness to take the mermaid's voice, which were eventually just replaced with smoke effects at some point. It's a shame too, since it was a pretty striking image. We get an abbreviated version of the movie's final act, with a brief laser effect of Ursula laughing. Voyage of the Little Mermaid closed in 2020. A revamped version is in development, but at the time of this video, it is not yet opened. Tokyo Disneyland one-upped its American cousins and has an entire indoor area called Mermaid Lagoon, fully themed to Ariel's Kingdom. Attraction-wise, the main draw used to be the theater. The original show had a live actress playing Ariel, with everyone else being played by puppeteers. The show's dialogue was in Japanese, but the songs were all in English. We open on Ariel, lamenting being stuck as a mermaid, singing her classic song. Try as they might, Sebastian and Flounder can't seem to cheer her up. Flotsam and Jetsam recommend Ursula services to her. If you were expecting the same Ursula puppet from Voyage of the Little Mermaid to appear, you'd be surprised. This version goes in a totally different direction, appearing as a gigantic head and a pair of hands, with the rest of the body being merely suggested. She feels like a cross between the mechanical Wizard of Oz from Wicked and Andros from Star Fox. As expected, she belts out Poor Unfortunate Souls, which appears to be a brand new Pat Carroll recording. It's a little hard to tell what happens next, since I don't have a translation. From what I gather, Ursula offers to turn Ariel human, but the mermaid either gets tricked, doesn't go through with it, or possibly even tricks Ursula herself. If anyone knows, please leave a comment. Regardless, the sea witch makes her exit, and the show ends with a rousing rendition of Under the Sea. The show ran from 2001 until 2014, when it was replaced with a new show focusing entirely on the good guys. This, in turn, was closed in 2020, and the theater is currently used as a meet and greet for Ariel. Another Mermaid Lagoon feature is Ariel's Playground, an elaborate walkthrough that covers many of the movie set pieces. This includes the Sea Dragon entrance to Ursula's lair, here officially called Ursula's Dungeon. Inside, the Sea Witch appears in a mirror. Flotsam and Jetsam can also be glimpsed at the end of a hall of funhouse mirrors. Over at Walt Disney Studios in Paris, there were unused plans for Le Jardin d'Ursula, or translated into English, Ursula's Garden. This would have been a carnival-style spinning ride with Ursula as the centerpiece. One piece of art shows it as being in the same mold as Dumbo, while another shows a more thrilling ride where each spinning tentacle holds guests in a separately spinning whirlpool. Appropriately, this is very similar to a model of carnival ride often called the Polyp or Octopus. Another attraction that never was would have been at California Adventure. At one point, the California Screamin' was going to get a villainous makeover, with Ursula serving as the entrance. Guests would have entered her gaping mouth to ride on the villain's Funhouse coaster. In the end, the coaster was rethemed to The Incredibles instead. It's been a while since I've talked about the interactive Sorcerers of the Magic Kingdom game, so to recap, Hades wants to take over the park and begins recruiting fellow villains. Ursula, as it turns out, has been languishing in the underworld's River of Souls, presumably after Eric jabbed her with the boat. Hades makes a deal. He'll bring her back to life. If she steals a special crystal piece for him, he'll keep her in the land of the living. As we know, Ursula loves making deals herself, and she's always willing to cheat so that she comes out on top. She decides to use her resurrection to flood the Magic Kingdom and take over herself. Flotsam and Jetsam have been restored as well, and do their best to help their mistress, along with Glut the Shark. Things get pretty soggy, and Ursula even manages to imitate Ariel perfectly at one point, right down to her voice. Inevitably, good triumphs over evil. Ursula rarely, if ever, has done any meet and greets, but she's been in plenty of shows and parades. Some parades have had animatronic Ursula figures, while others have had a costumed character riding atop floats. Somewhat recently, a mobile version of the Ursula costume was introduced, gliding across the parade route, holding her magic contract. Puppet versions of Flotsam and Jetsam are often incorporated as well. Meanwhile, Chef Louie has appeared a few times as a meetable character, although he's generally a rare sight. Some of the rarest characters of all have appeared in various Disney on Ice shows. Their version of The Little Mermaid featured not only Ursula, but also Louie, Vanessa, and the Polyps. I can't find any images of Flotsam and Jetsam, but I assume they were at least represented by puppets. There's also an enormous prop version of Glut. Ursula played a decent role in the original version of Disneyland's Fantasmic. She's the second villain to attack Mickey's dreams after the Evil Queen, singing a short verse of Poor Unfortunate Souls. An inflatable Ursula animatronic used to appear in front of the water projections for the first 10 years or so, but it was retired due to a number of technical problems. In 2009, Flotsam and Jetsam floats were added, but were quickly removed due to different technical problems. Disney World received their Fantasmic in 1997, meaning they had a bigger well of Disney Renaissance villains to draw from. Although Ursula still appears, she doesn't get as much stage time, now having to share it with characters like Jafar and Hades. Ursula has performed in numerous other shows, usually doing her signature song. In World of Color Villainous, she's backed up by her polyps. In Villains Tonight, performed on the cruise ships, she does a full lounge version, accompanied by some chorus girls. Pain and Panic, who've been watching from the audience, gets so swept up that they also can't help but join in the song. Most recently, an entire Little Mermaid show was mounted on the Disney Wish cruise line. Ursula's number leans heavily into the cabaret influence, and her eels even get to sing with her at a few points. I did notice that this version is also missing the verse about Ariel not speaking. I really hope this hasn't become the standard for Ursula's song, but I suppose time can only tell. I can't find full version of the show, but according to a review on the Princess blog, this version puts a lot of emphasis on Ariel finding her voice in both a literal and symbolic sense, and using it to empower herself. If Ariel's triumph was going to hit that emotional mark, then they especially needed a verse where the villainess tries to put her down. I know I might be coming off as complaining here, but the more I write about this, the more baffling these recent choices seem. So I want to thank everyone who made it this far. This is undoubtedly my longest villains video yet, and it couldn't have been about a more deserving character. But before I wrap things up, I wanted to talk about an obscure Disneyland event from 2000 that was documented in the early days of the internet, but has now been forgotten. Ursula is tangentially involved, and the other villainesses featured have already been covered, so this is probably the last time I can reasonably talk about this. Well, outside one of my catching up videos, but hey, we're already here, let's do this. The Disney Diva Villains event was held on October 26, 2000, and is documented in laughingplace.com's archives. After a fancy dinner and a chance to get some exclusive art and merchandise, the guests got to see a special musical villainous review. The host is Calamari, described as the unauthorized sister of Ursula. Since the video clips are all inactive, I can't tell if this was a joke the website was making, or if this was actually a line from the show. Please note that as far as Ursula's sisters are concerned, Return to the Sea only came out the previous month, so most audience members might not have been familiar with Morgana. Calamari performs What Else But Poor Unfortunate Souls, backed up by some she-urchins, a couple of ladies with some very spiky hair. The Queen of Hearts briefly takes stage next, alongside Alice and the White Rabbit. One of the coolest performances was probably the next one, led by Little Leota. She gets joined by 3 other Haunted Mansion ladies. The opera singer, what appears to be a ballroom dancer, and most amazingly, the original Beating Heart Bride. The quartet performs Grim Grinning Ghosts, and then rides off in a doom buggy. Francis from Bug's Life makes a cameo, most likely complaining that he's not a villain or a girl. Cruella comes next, singing Puppy Love and How Much Is That Doggy in the Window. The evil queen hilariously sings Reflection from Mulan. At the end, she looks into the enormous magic mirror, only to see her true self reflected as the old hag. The Queen and Cruella come together to perform My Strongest Suit from Aida. Madame Mim, we're told, appears as a flea on Cruella's fur coat, and a worm in the Queen's apple. Luckily, Maleficent was invited, sparing everyone her wrath. She sings that old black magic, and then gets the whole cast together to sing what I believe is an original song about divas. The biggest surprise comes at the end when the 3 good fairies appear. The villainesses are not happy, but the fairies explain they were invited by Disneyland president Cynthia Harris and invite her on stage with another original song. Harris then closes the show, and guests are treated to special trips on the Fantasyland dark rides. What makes them special? Each one has a live villainess in the final scene. Reportedly, Calamari was in Snow White, a devil girl jumped out in Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, a creepy puppet girl was in Pinocchio, and Peter Pan's Flight had Cruella and a mermaid. It's not in the Laughing Place write-up, but I remember reading a different account, which I can no longer find, that said that the mermaid was asking guests if they'd drown Wendy for her. She was especially excited when one of the guests told her yes. The villains finally closed the show on the balcony of Sleeping Beauty Castle. If anyone, somehow, has more photos or videos from that event, please consider posting them somewhere. It sounded like a lot of fun. Okay, now we're at the end for real. Thank you again, not only for watching this series, but also for being so patient while I put these together. I'm doing my best to make sure they're all worth the wait. I still have my work cut out for me on the next one, because we'll be covering the sizable rogues gallery of Darkwing Duck. Let's get dangerous.